Leosim Chaniopo Umawayim. Greetings to you once again. Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I'm going to be talking on one of my very favorite topics and sharing with you about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Of course, it was adopted at the UN General Assembly on September 13th, 2007 with only 4 votes against, approximately 147 votes in favor, and 11 abstentions. Everybody knows, I think, the 4 countries that voted against the UN declaration. It's a quiz. You can do homework if you don't know who those 4 were, but all of them within the next 3 years, the United States being the very last, reversed their position and endorsed the UN declaration. So there are still some countries that are on record as abstaining, like the Russian Federation, for example. But even some of those states that abstained have now turned to support the declaration. So there are no countries officially opposed to the UN declaration. Now, it took us 30 years from the very first UN conference in 1977 to the adoption in 2007 is 30 years. And some of us, like myself, had both children and grandchildren born during the time that we were working on the UN Declaration. And when we start to look at what its contents are, I think that we can see why it was such a momentous achievement, and maybe also why this took so long, because it had to be the states, the countries at the end of the day that were the ones that were going to vote in favor of it. I have a slide here just showing some of the activities that we undertook. Please don't think that going to the United Nations just means put on a nice dress or a suit and tie and make a speech. This was actually a struggle, the kind of struggle that we have in the streets of our homeland. We took it to the United Nations. For example, in 1996, we had a walkout of all of the Indigenous representatives and delegates in opposition to the president of the session, the intersessional working group that was set up by the Commission on Human Rights, telling us we were just observers. We couldn't select a co-chair of the session. And so we said, no, we're not going to sit here and just be observers in a discussion that affected our lives, our survival, our homelands, our children and future generations. We have to be more than observers. And as a result of this walkout, which lasted 4 days until the president of the session, Ambassador Urrutia at that time from Peru, came and met with us and said, okay, we can't go on talking about the rights of Indigenous peoples if Indigenous peoples are not in the room. And he recognized that we would be part on an equal basis of deciding what the text would be, either agreeing or opposing changes to the original text that had been adopted a few years earlier by the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, again with our direct participation. And it really changed the outcome at the end of the day. So I just want to encourage you to look at that history and see how Indigenous peoples struggled and engaged. Another slide I have here is the hunger strike that we had in 2004. 5 Indigenous delegates from throughout the Americas went on a 4-day hunger strike and spiritual fast to call world attention to some of the proposals that were being made by some of the states, like the United States, that actually would have diminished our rights in comparison to the rights of other peoples under international law. And we wanted to find a way to make that be known and to make the depth of our commitment to this process be known in the United Nations, but outside around the world. And the last picture is some of the demonstrations that we had in front of the permanent missions of New Zealand, Canada, United States, and Australia, just in the last couple of days before the vote at the General Assembly. in opposition to what we had heard was going to be their decision to vote against the declaration. So these are just some of the activities that we undertook in so many years of work on the declaration. And I also want to recognize that many of those that started this work at the United Nations did not live in this world, at least, to see the conclusion, but their contributions continued to inspire us as we carried forth. And I have a picture of just some of the delegates that led this work and were major contributors to the text. But that did not live in this world again, as I said, to see the adoption at the General Assembly, but we want to recognize them. I want to say a word about human rights. Because this, of course, is a human rights instrument. And like I mentioned, it's the first human rights standard that actually had the full participation of what they call the beneficiaries of the rights, in this case, Indigenous peoples, in the development of the text and the final agreement. And it's important to recognize that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, adopted in 1948, the first United Nations human rights standard, recognized the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. So it's important for us to recognize, even though we weren't part of drafting those words, we weren't at the United Nations in 1948, that the declaration needed to represent a recognition of inherent rights. It even goes further than the Universal Declaration. Instead of inherent dignity, it talks about inherent rights of Indigenous peoples. And when we developed the preamble and the language that talks about our inherent rights, it recognized that our rights derive from political, economic, and social structures, and from our cultures, spiritual traditions, histories, and philosophies, and especially, and this is a universal principle for Indigenous peoples around the world, our lands, territories, and resources. And it's very important to recognize that because the UN Declaration recognizes inherent rights, and that rights are inherent according to the United Nations overall, that no declaration, no constitution, no convention or treaty can give rights or take them away. Our rights are inherent. And for us as Indigenous peoples, we would say, because the Creator placed us on the land that is our place of origin, we have inherent rights in that place and to that place. So rights can be violated and they can be upheld, but they can't be given or taken away. Our rights are inherent, and it's very important. The preamble of the UN Declaration affirms that. The Declaration also says in its text in Article 43 that it is the minimum standard for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world. And this means that it is not the ceiling, but it is the floor. It's the floor we never had to stand on before. So that is really important. Some of the states wanted to take that language away because the declaration came out to be very strong in most of its articles. There's a couple that we weren't 100% happy with, but it was adopted by the states. So in the end, it is a UN declaration, but it is the minimum standard. It's the least we can accept, whether we're negotiating with our local school board, our municipality, our province, or the federal government, or a United Nations body. It's the least we can accept. And that's what the minimum standard means. We all have to commit to uphold that, or all of this work really was for less than what we would have hoped. It's also the first United Nations human rights standards that primarily recognizes collective rights. It affirms our rights are indispensable our collective rights for our existence, well-being, and integral development as peoples. And this is very important, and part of what our many years of struggle was about, because we were doing something that had never been done before. Not only were we, as the recipients, the beneficiaries of the rights, directly engaged in the negotiations, but we were also saying that our rights had to be recognized collectively as peoples. Our lands, our cultures, our languages, our spiritual practices, our political systems must be exercised collectively. And within that, we also have rights as individuals, of course, as well as having rights as individual members of the human family, as persons, to all of the human rights instruments that recognize individual human rights. Sometimes people ask, what was the struggle in English? It's just an S, a difference between people and peoples. And why was that so important? And why did that take so long? That was one of the last things that was agreed by the states in the whole process of work on the UN Declaration, is to use the term Indigenous peoples. And it says that in the preamble, affirming that Indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples in our rights. And we really realized, in including, negotiating with the states, that part of their concern was not the UN Declaration, but actually Article 1 in Common of the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic and Social and cultural rights, with the famous all peoples language in Article 1 of both, that says all peoples have the right to self-determination. And this is a right exercised in conformity with international law. And this was actually the resistance to using the term peoples, is that would imply and affirm that we also have a right to self-determination exercised in conformity with international law. The UN Declaration also affirms that we, in the exercise of our rights, should be free from any form of discrimination. And this slide just shows a picture of actual discrimination that is ongoing, one of many examples. It shows a Christian cemetery, and no offense to any Christians, but it is beautifully kept with a fence and a nice lawn and very respected. And the next picture down is a picture of them actually digging up an Indigenous people's cemetery in California, United States, to make way for a highway. And this is just an example of the way that our rights are discriminated against. But the UN Declaration affirms that we should be free from any form of discrimination. Article 3, which again restates what I just mentioned, Article 1 in Common of the two international covenants, which says all peoples have the right to self-determination. This uses the exact same language. And really, we discussed this a lot during those years. If the UN had already said in legally binding covenants that most states are party to, that all peoples have the right to self-determination, and we as Indigenous peoples are certainly peoples, then why is it even necessary? Because there was racism in the room of negotiation, and there continues to be discrimination in the UN system itself. So we needed to have Article 3 using those exact same words, and I'm going to read it. I'm not going to read all the articles because I know you all have your little purse and pocket-sized copy of the UN Declaration. Keep it by your bed at night, and you can read the articles in full. But this one was one of the hardest fought articles throughout all of those decades. So I'm going to read it. It says, Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. That is the same words with just the term Indigenous peoples instead of all peoples as the two international covenants. This was probably another of the hardest fought articles, the article on lands, territories, and resources. And there's a cluster of articles that affirm these relationships and rights. And the hard language in Article 26 to get adopted and endorsed by the states was the terminology that says Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally occupied, owned, or otherwise used or acquired. And of course, the states, some of them don't even recognize Indigenous peoples' land rights at all. And others may recognize land rights, but only, for example, in the United States, certain reservations that they have agreed. These are not the original lands that we traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. It also affirms that states shall, and that's an important word in the Declaration because the use of the term shall throughout when it talks about state obligations is not common language for a declaration. Usually the states wanted, in this case, for it to say states should. And we said, we're not going to sit here for 30 years or more and talk about what you should or shouldn't do. We need that prescriptive language, state shall. So throughout the Declaration, when it talks about state obligations, it uses the word shall. States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Very important because in many states, there are no legally recognized Indigenous peoples' lands. So this is something that we still need to work on based on the fact that these same states adopted the UN Declaration. So we need to keep pressing. There's still a lot of work to do for implementation. Article 25 is a lot of people's, Indigenous people's favorite declaration because it shows so much of the spirit of the Indigenous peoples that worked on this. No other international standard adopted by the General Assembly uses these kinds of words where it talks about Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters, and coastal seas and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. Beautiful, beautiful language from Indigenous peoples that now is adopted by the General Assembly. It talks about and affirms our cultural rights and our sacred sites. This is Article 12. And again, I'm not going to read all of these articles. You can refer to them, but it does affirm these key rights for our survival and identity, our access to our sacred sites and cultural sites, and to maintain our religious traditions, customs, and ceremonies. Article 20 affirms our right to subsistence, to maintain our traditional economies and be secure in the enjoyment of our own means of subsistence. That's our right to food, our right to hunt, to gather, to herd, and to farm, of course. The right to health and traditional health related practices. And this is a right that has been especially important to assert and affirm given the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. It talks about not only our right to have equal access to health care of the state, and this is seen as a right that has been violated throughout the pandemic around the world, including in the United States, but also our right to practice our traditional practices and to conserve our medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. The resurgence and reaffirmation of our traditional health practices has been especially important and has saved many lives, including my own when I became sick with COVID. The use of our traditional plants and herbs were, I think, part of the reason that my family was able to survive the pandemic. Of course, the international standing of treaties, Article 37. This was one that the International Indian Treaty Council fought very hard for. That clear affirmation of the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of our treaties, and also the affirmation in the second paragraph of Article 37 that nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as diminishing or eliminating our treaty rights. If our treaty rights are stronger than what's in the UN Declaration, those stand. They aren't being able to be diminished because of the declaration. Also, the right to free, prior, informed consent. And this was one of the hardest fought articles as well. Canada, on the very last day at the vote of the Human Rights Council, which is what had to happen before it went to the General Assembly, took the floor and said that this right was the reason that they were not going to vote in favor. They voted against. Along with the Russian Federation at the Human Rights Council when it was adopted there in the year before in 2006. Especially this one is something that the states have a lot of problem with now, and in fact is violated all over the place, including here in the US. It says states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions. We get to pick, who speaks for us, is what that means, in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting our lands, territories, or other resources. And this is a picture of a violation of that right. A protest against it is the Standing Rock Water Defenders in South Dakota opposing the DAPL pipeline. Also, this is the one that especially Canada mentioned as one they didn't like. Article 19, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples concerned in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. Very strong language, very strong and very important as well, that we have a say in measures that are going to affect us and our lands and our children. It also affirms that Indigenous peoples need special protections, such as women, elders, children, persons with disabilities, and that these protections have to be upheld. And further, in Article 22, it also guarantees that Indigenous women and children should enjoy full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence. And we say that that must include environmental violence as well as other forms of violence. And I hope all of you read the UN Declaration and use it, because if you don't use it in every declaration that your tribe or your community makes, in your court cases, in all of the affirmations you're making to defend your rights, then all of this work is not going to have the effect that we all hoped it would while we were working on it. I'm just going to give a couple of examples of how we've been able to use that at the UN Declaration and the rights it contains and affirms, and how that has made a difference for Indigenous peoples on the ground. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Indigenous peoples have been active there for at least 20 years and have consistently protested our lack of inclusion, our lack of ability to participate in decision making at the United Nations in this body that directly affects our survival. Article 18 of the UN Declaration affirms the right to participate in decision making in matters that would affect our rights. And this again has been adopted by the General Assembly. Why aren't the United Nations bodies then upholding it? That's a good question. A lot of times we have to press them. These are some of the Indigenous peoples demonstrations during COP21 in 2015, where the famous Paris Agreement was affirmed. And through a lot of activism there and lobbying and press conferences and a lot of discussions with states, we were finally able to have the rights of Indigenous peoples be recognized in a legally binding environmental convention for the first time ever. We also affirmed there our right to traditional knowledge, Article 31 of the UN Declaration, our right to maintain, control, protect, and develop our cultural heritage, including our seeds, our knowledge of flora and fauna. All of these things are not only impacted by climate change, but they also can contribute to the solutions based on the traditional knowledge and ways of knowing of Indigenous peoples. So the Paris decision also recognized our knowledge and created a local communities and Indigenous peoples platform in paragraph 135, based on a recognition of the value and contributions of Indigenous peoples' culture and knowledge. At COP24, COP means Conference of the Parties, of course. All conventions and treaties have regular Conference of the Parties, and the states are the parties. We aren't the parties, but we're there participating and fighting for our peoples as however we can. But at COP24 in Katowice, Poland in 2018, the platform was actually adopted. And this photo is very historic because it has Indigenous delegates and the state delegates together that worked on an agreement of how to implement the what's called Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform for the UNFCCC. And it's very important that the adoptive language emphasized the UN Declaration in its entirety. This was shockingly important and a real historic breakthrough for Indigenous peoples. And this is a picture of us. I say us because we, for the first time in history, got to choose our own representatives in the UN body that sit in equal balance to state delegates. There are 7 Indigenous representatives that are members of the LCIP, of the Facilitative Working Group for the platform, and there are 7 state representatives from around the world, and we sit in an equal basis, and we actually got to select our own representatives. They don't have to be filtered or selected through state bodies like the Permanent Forum or the MREP. So this was a real breakthrough, not just for Indigenous people sitting at the table to talk about how to implement programs on climate change that affect our lives on the ground on a day-to-day basis, but for our recognition of our right to participate as true representatives in decision making. I'm just going to give one other example. This is actually something that directly affects my nation and my people. Article 11 of the UN Declaration, paragraph 2, provides for redress mechanisms, which may include restitution developed in conjunction together with Indigenous peoples regarding our cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property that was taken without our free prior informed consent, or, and this is very important, or in violation of our laws, traditions, and customs. And this is one of only 2 places in the whole declaration that uses terminology of laws. We have laws, it recognizes, that govern the control of our cultural and spiritual items. And this is a picture of our sacred Masokova that is still in the Swedish National Museum of Ethnography in Stockholm. We discovered it in 2003 when I was there at the invitation of the Samis for a Day of Indigenous Peoples event. And they took me upstairs and looked at the items in the National Museum in Stockholm, and I saw shockingly our Masokova, our traditional spiritual core of our religious beliefs and practices of our peoples. And we believe that this is not an artifact, it's a living being once it's been in a ceremony. We were able, through the UN Declaration, to get the UN Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples to take on a country engagement with the Yaquis, which are both in Arizona, where I am, and in Sonora, Mexico, as well as IATC, because we filed the case. and called for recognition of our laws having to do with the Masakova, which means it must stay in our homelands, was taken by anthropologists in the 1930s from prisoners of war. We were still at war with Mexico at that time. And this is some of our Yaqui representatives speaking with the MRIP in 2019. They also recognized the right to repatriation that's affirmed in Article 12 of the UN Declaration. They held for the first time an expert seminar on international repatriation based on the work of on the Masakova. They are pushing for what the UN Declaration called for, which is to create a new mechanism or body together with Indigenous peoples to talk about how our items that belong to Indigenous peoples around the world and are in museums and universities and auction houses can be returned to our peoples for our health and well-being. And this is our IATC and Yaqui delegation there at this international conference that was hosted at University of British Columbia in Vancouver a year ago, last March. So probably part that we have to recognize, and the frustration is that there is a lack of good faith in the implementation by states, that everything we gain, we have to push them and push them. It took us 17 years to obtain finally the agreement by the government of Sweden that they needed to return the Masakova to us for ethical and moral reasons, but also because the MRIP pushed for a recognition of our laws, traditions, and customs on an equal basis as the laws that Sweden has governing the property that they have acquired one way or another through the process of colonization. So it's something that can be done. It takes a lot of perseverance. It takes the involvement of the community, but it is a challenge that remains, is to secure implementation of the rights that they already have affirmed at the country level. And I just want to end with a quote that really stood out to me. After we arranged with the UN Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who at the time in 2012 was James Anaya, based here in Tucson at the University of Arizona, for a tour of the United States, focused on implementation of the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. After the tour was over and he submitted his very strong recommendations to the United States, we met here at the university and talked about the tour and the results. And one of the representatives from the Navajo Nation, the Dene Nation, said, well, we got really good recommendations, but I wondered, where are the teeth? How do we put the teeth in this process? How do we push the states to implement and recognize that they have to implement these rights that they have already agreed to? He said, but then I started thinking and I realized, wait a minute, we are the teeth. If it's going to be implemented, it's because we are going to push, we are going to convince them, we are going to show them that it is in their best interest as well as ours to recognize and uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples. So I just want to leave you with that thought. This is a picture of a little girl reading the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2017. And the declaration was 10 years old, and so was she. And she was just reading it on her own. And so I think that these two things together, the future generations using this, understanding it, and understanding that it belongs to them and their peoples, and our understanding that it's up to us, just like it has been through this whole process. It's up to us. We can't sit back and wait for somebody to do this for them. We need to do it ourselves. Brothers and sisters, we are the teeth. Chokwe Otasia. Thank you very much.